It was a brutal 20 degrees below zero, and Sarah, in her Mrs. Claus costume, was on her hands and knees in the freezing slush. She was utterly humiliated by a rich bully who had just kicked her basket of candy canes, laughing as he filmed her anguish to entertain his friends. But the laughter died in his throat as a deep, menacing growl ripped through the cheerful Christmas music. Sarah looked up, her gaze meeting 100 pounds of a battle-scarred German shepherd. The dog loomed over her, and behind him a Navy SEAL who looked prepared for absolute war. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with your heart. Please consider subscribing for more. The punishing late December wind tore through the lanes of brightly lit stalls. At the Oak Ridge Christmas market, the air carrying the scents of roasted chestnuts and pine painting a deceptively picturesque scene. It was the kind of perfect image you'd find on a greeting card, but for Sarah, a 32-year-old widow shivering behind her tray of candy canes, the piercing cold was anything but romantic. Sarah's kind face was etched with exhaustion, her brown hair concealed beneath a scratchy synthetic white wig. She adjusted the velvet bodice of her costume. "Only 2 more hours," she pleaded inwardly. "Just 2 more hours for Lily." She whispered the words like a desperate prayer, her voice trembling in the frigid air as she tried to shift the weight on her agonizingly sore feet. The boots provided by the event organizers were a size too small, cruelly pinching her toes, yet she forced a smile as a passing couple took a candy cane. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, though the couple hardly acknowledged her. Every hour she endured was another $20 toward her daughter, Lily's school tuition. Since her husband Michael had passed away 2 years ago, Sarah learned that pride was a luxury she simply could not afford. She clutched the candy tray like a lifeline as the cold sank into her very bones, feeling utterly invisible amidst the joy and laughter surrounding her. Across the bustling market square, Mason, a 38-year-old Navy SEAL on mandatory leave, was battling a different kind of cold entirely. He stood a towering 6'4", his broad shoulders straining against a dark wool coat, his steel-gray eyes relentlessly scanning the perimeter. It was an instinct he couldn't turn off. "Easy, Bear," Mason rumbled deep in his chest to the massive German shepherd that never left his side. Bear, a retired military working dog with a black and tan coat and a slightly clipped ear, pressed his flank firmly against Mason's leg. The dog whined softly. "I know, buddy. Too many people," Mason assured him, his voice rough but deeply affectionate. "We'll do 1 lap and head back to the cabin." They moved through the crowd as one, a silent island in a chaotic sea of holiday cheer, and Mason felt the familiar suffocation closing in, of being surrounded by the unguarded joy that felt so alien after his last tour. He simply tightened his grip on the leather leash. He drew a quiet strength from the dog's solid presence. They were 2 warriors trying to learn how to exist in a world that no longer demanded a fight. And tonight, amidst the carols, they both felt utterly alone. But then Sarah's attention was violently ripped from her thoughts. A boisterous group of teenagers was shoving its way through the crowd, led by a tall, arrogant boy. He was a lanky kid with a pricey haircut and a condescending sneer, the son of a local tycoon flanked by 3 laughing friends. They came to a halt directly in front of Sarah. "Whoa, check this out," the leader jeered, pulling out his smartphone. He shoved the camera lens uncomfortably close to Sarah's face. "Hey guys, get a load of Mrs. Claus right here. Looks like she got that costume from a dumpster." Sarah felt her face burn with a deep shame as she tried to turn her head away, but the boy stepped even closer. "Please, just let me do my job," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Move along!" The boy laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sliced through the festive music. "Or what, you gonna hit me with a candy cane?" he mocked. Then, in a chilling moment of malice, he looked at his friends and declared, "Watch this," as he swung his leg out. He kicked the heavy basket of candy canes she was holding. "Oops," he shouted, as the brutal impact drove the basket right into Sarah's stomach. She gasped. No! As she lost her footing, slipping on a patch of ice and falling hard onto the cold pavement. The red and white candy shattered around her like broken promises. Across the square, the change in Bear was instantaneous as a low, thunderous growl vibrated from his chest. "Bear heel," Mason commanded initially, but when he saw the woman crash to the ground and the boy wind up for another kick, his instincts took over. "Go," he whispered, releasing the tension on the leash just enough. Bear launched forward not to attack, but to intercept. The German Shepherd landed with a heavy thud between Sarah and her assailant, unleashing a bark so ferocious it silenced the entire crowd. The boy stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "Get that thing away from me!" he shrieked, his arrogance vanishing in an instant. Before he could recover, Mason stepped into the light, his massive frame blocking the view of the terrified teenagers. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. He stared down at the boy with eyes utterly devoid of warmth. "Back up." Mason set his voice a low, dangerous rumble that promised violence if he was ignored. "You lay your hands on a woman, is that what you do?" The boy stammered, his voice trembling. She just slipped. It was a complete accident. Get your beast under control!" Mason took a single, deliberate step forward, and the entire group of teenagers recoiled as if from a physical blow. "This is not a dog," Mason stated, his voice dangerously calm. "He's a soldier, and you are leaving now." The authority in his tone was absolute and terrifying. The leader muttered a pathetic curse before he turned and fled, his friends scrambling behind him, escaping the predator they had so foolishly awakened. Mason watched them vanish for a brief second before the hardness in his posture dissolved. He turned to Sarah, still on the pavement, and his voice was now impossibly gentle. "Ma'am, are you injured?" The raw adrenaline that had electrified the air began to recede, leaving behind a profound and stinging silence. In the corner of the market square, Mason stood like a stone guardian amidst the scattered glittering debris of broken Christmas candies. His breathing remained steady, his piercing gaze shifting from the fleeing silhouettes of the youths down to the vulnerable woman on the ground. Sarah was still sitting on the frigid cobblestones, her legs splayed at an unnatural angle, every breath catching in her throat like a sob. She was struggling to comprehend the violence that had erupted, and then vanished in the span of a single minute while the once loud crowd watched from a distance. They were keeping a respectful space, their hushed whispers floating on the wind like ghosts. Mason extended his hand, the palm rough and calloused. It was a shocking contrast to the soft velvet of her coat sleeve. "Here," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that was no longer a threat. It was a deeply grounding sound. "Let me help you up. We'll go slow." Sarah looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He was terrifyingly large, a mountain of a man with a face that looked as though it had been hewn from granite and hardship, and yet his eyes held a staggering amount of genuine concern. She hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, her ingrained independence, warring with the throbbing, agonizing pain in her ankle. Then she reached out, and his hand securely enveloped hers, the grip firm and sure. He pulled her to her feet with an ease that made her feel almost weightless. But the moment her right foot made contact with the ground, a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. "Ah!" she cried out, her knees buckling instantly. But before she could fall, Mason was there catching her again, his arm wrapped around her waist, a solid anchor supporting her entire weight. "Easy," he murmured, his hold tightening just enough to keep her upright. It was a protective, not an intrusive gesture. "Don't put any weight on that. I think that punk may have done some real damage." Sarah leaned into him, mortified by her own sudden frailty. But grateful for his strength, the adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, leaving only a deep, biting cold in its wake. With the fear no longer a distraction, the freezing night air sliced right through her thin Mrs. Claus costume. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't form words, and Mason felt every tremor rack her body. Pressed against his side, he frowned, his gaze dropping to her paper-thin attire, a cheap velvet dress. It offered absolutely no defense against a December night in Oak Ridge. Without a word, he released her for a brief second. Balancing her against him, he unbuttoned his heavy wool coat. "You're freezing," he stated, his voice a low rumble. He shrugged the coat from his broad shoulders, revealing a thick, tactical sweater that defined the powerful lines of his chest. The cold didn't seem to touch him as he draped the coat around Sarah's shoulders, the massive garment swallowing her whole. It engulfed her petite frame in an immediate, overwhelming warmth that smelled of cedar and clean soap, and something unmistakably masculine that made Sarah's heart falter in her chest. "Oh no, I couldn't!" Sarah stammered, her hands instinctively clutching the lapels, even as she tried to protest his kindness. "You'll be cold. I can't take your coat." Mason simply shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm fine, ma'am. We train in frozen water. Standing here in a town square is nothing," he assured her. His tone left no room for debate. "Keep it on. Getting hypothermia on top of a sprained ankle is a bad combination." As the comforting warmth settled over her, Sarah felt a gentle, wet nose press into her hand and looked down to see the massive German shepherd. The very one who had looked like a demon moments ago was now gazing up at her with soft, liquid brown eyes. Bear whined softly, a high-pitched sound impossible from such a powerful chest, and licked her fingers, his warm tongue chasing away the chill. In that instant, all of Sarah's fear of the animal dissolved. "Hello there," she whispered, scratching him behind the ears. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" At her words, Bear leaned his full weight against her leg, closing his eyes in pure contentment. Mason watched this, a flicker of genuine shock piercing his stoic expression. After all, Bear was a retired military working dog. Conditioned to detect explosives and neutralize threats, he was a professional soldier, aloof and utterly indifferent to civilians. For him to offer comfort to a stranger, to so openly seek affection, was completely unheard of. "He likes you," Mason observed, his voice tinged with sheer bewilderment. "He normally doesn't give anyone the time of day. He's a retired K-9 trained to be suspicious of everyone. This is incredibly rare." Sarah managed a weak, yet genuine smile, the first she'd mustered all evening. "Animals know," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "They know when you're hurting." The profound connection between the woman and the dog seemed to soften the night's brutal edges. It created an intimate circle of peace amid the market's lingering chaos. "We need to get you off that ankle." Mason's words broke the spell as he saw her wince again. "Do you have a car here?" Sarah shook her head, a fresh wave of anxiety crashing over her. "No, I take the bus. The stop is just 2 blocks over." Mason's gaze dropped to her swollen ankle. He then looked at the slick, icy pavement and finally at the bus stop far in the distance. He shook his head firmly. "Not happening," he declared. "You can't walk 2 blocks on that. And standing in the snow waiting will only make it worse. My truck is parked right around the corner. I'm driving you home." Sarah's pride flared instantly. She was accustomed to handling everything on her own, always being the one who solved problems. She was never the one who needed saving. "Sir, really, I can manage? You've already done more than enough. I don't want to be the burden." Mason looked her directly in the eye, his expression a mixture of profound seriousness and kindness. "You're not a burden, and I'm not leaving an injured woman alone in the cold moments after she was just assaulted. This isn't about what you want right now. It's about what you need. Please let me do this." The sincerity in his voice completely crumbled her defenses. She glanced from his earnest face down to Bear, who was still pressed firmly against her leg, as if to anchor her to the spot. "Okay," she whispered, a sound of both defeat and deep gratitude. "Okay, thank you." Mason shifted his weight, allowing her to use him as a support. "Lean on me, Bear." Load up," he commanded. The dog immediately trotted ahead, clearing a path through the curious onlookers who were finally starting to disperse. They moved at a crawl toward the parking lot, Mason shortening his powerful strides to match her agonizing, limping hop, until they finally reached his vehicle. a black Ford F-150 that looked as rugged and well-maintained as its owner. He opened the passenger door and easily lifted her up onto the seat. Handling her with a surprising gentleness, he buckled her in before walking around to the driver's side as he climbed in and started the engine. The heater roared to life, filling the cab with warm air, the sudden quiet of the truck's interior. Shutting out the noise of the Christmas market felt incredibly intimate. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound being the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the soft panting of Bear from the back seat. Sarah pulled Mason's coat tighter around herself, burying her nose slightly in the collar. "I'm Sarah, by the way," she said, breaking the silence, realizing she hadn't even introduced herself to the man who had saved her. She looked over at him, the dashboard lights casting shadows across his strong features. Mason kept his eyes on the road as he pulled out of the lot. "But his grip on the steering wheel relaxed, Mason," he replied. "And the beast in the back is Bear." Sarah glanced back at the dog, who was now resting his head on the back of her seat. "Watching the road, he's amazing." "You said he's retired. Are you out too?" Mason shook his head, his expression tightening slightly. "No, ma'am. I'm still active duty Navy SEAL. I'm just back on leave for a few weeks to decompress." He paused, glancing in the rearview mirror at his dog. "Bear is the one who's retired. He took some shrapnel on our last tour, earned his pension early. I adopted him so he wouldn't have to go to a kennel." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy mixed with admiration. "So you have to go back?" she asked softly. Eventually Mason replied, his voice neutral, though Sarah detected a hint of weariness. "But for now, I'm just a guy with a truck trying to get you home safely." Sarah nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. "I'm a widow," she added, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, wanting to offer him a piece of her own truth in return. "It's just me and my daughter Lily. I do this the costume, the candy for her tuition." Mason didn't offer pity, which she appreciated. Instead, he nodded with respect. "You're tough, Sarah, a lot tougher than those punks back there." He paused, then added quietly, "Lily is lucky to have you." The compliment, simple and direct, made Sarah flush for the first time in a long time. She felt something shift inside her. Not pity, not charity, but a profound acknowledgement, a warrior recognizing a fellow warrior. The journey from the twinkling Christmas market back to Sarah's quiet world was fleeting. Their path wound away from the joyous glow of the town square, leading them into a neighborhood hushed and shadowed, where homes huddled closer and streetlights fought the darkness with a nervous, intermittent buzz. Mason carefully navigated his formidable truck through the narrow, fragile streets, a gentle giant in a delicate world, finally easing into the fractured driveway of a humble, single-story bungalow. It was a home that seemed to be holding its breath, fighting to maintain its dignity against the relentless wear of time and weather, the paint having surrendered in places. It revealed the weary, gray wood beneath a pale yellow facade, yet through its windows a warm, inviting glow radiated a beacon of life. An amber light that defiantly pushed back against the encroaching cold of the night. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she unbuckled her belt. "It isn't much, but it's ours." Mason cut the engine, and a heavy silence descended upon the cab, thick with unspoken thoughts. "It looks like a home," he replied, his voice low and certain, and he truly meant it. For a man whose last decade was spent in sterile barracks, temporary tents, and the cold, cramped bunks of military transports, a house filled with warm light felt like a forgotten dream. He exited the truck, rounded the front, and once more assisted Sarah, his every movement a study in practiced, gentle care. Bear leapt from the back seat, his powerful form shaking loose the chill as he immediately began to scan the new perimeter, his nose twitching, deciphering the scent of this strange new territory. Sarah leaned her full weight against Mason's steady frame as they moved up the short concrete walk. She fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling uncontrollably from the biting cold. The deep chill still clung to her bones despite his heavy coat. The instant the lock gave a sharp click, and the door swung inward. A sudden blur of motion erupted from within the living room. "Mommy, you're back!" A high, piercing voice shrieked with joy. It was Lily Sarah's 6-year-old daughter, charging toward them in pink flannel pajamas dotted with little clouds. Her mother's brown hair was pulled into messy pigtails, framing a face with bright, inquisitive eyes that suddenly flashed wide with sheer terror. She skidded to a jarring halt, her joyful momentum instantly extinguished at the sight of the towering, shadowy figure of Mason filling the doorway, and the wolf-like creature standing guard at his side. Lily gasped, stumbling back a few steps, her tiny hands twisting the hem of her pajama top. "Mommy," she breathed, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. Sarah immediately hobbled forward, abandoning the support of the doorframe to close the distance. "It's all right, sweetie, it's okay." Sarah soothed, her tone soft and reassuring, as she reached for her daughter. "I hurt my ankle, and this very kind man just helped me get home. He's a friend." Mason felt that familiar, sharp pang of guilt. His imposing size and the stories etched into his skin so often had this very effect on people, especially on children. He instinctively tried to make himself smaller, hunching his shoulders almost imperceptibly. "Hi there, Lily," he said, forcing his voice into a softness his gravelly tone fought against. "I'm Mason, and this," he gestured to the dog, "is Bear." At the sound of his name, Bear, who had been standing like a sentinel, looked at the small girl. The dog seemed to sense the terror radiating from her tiny frame. Without a single command from Mason, Bear slowly lowered his powerful body, sinking onto his belly on the worn entryway rug. He rested his chin on his front paws and let out a soft, disarming huff, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the floorboards. The transformation from a war dog to an oversized carpet was immediate. Lily peeked out from behind her mother's leg, her curiosity locked in a war with her caution. Is he a wolf?" she asked, her eyes impossibly wide with awe and fear. A genuine smile cracked through Mason's hardened expression. It was a warmth that softened the harsh lines of his face. "No, he's just a big puppy. He likes ear scratches if you're brave enough." Lily hesitated, her eyes searching her mother's face for confirmation. Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, baby. He's very gentle." Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Lily stepped forward. She reached out a trembling hand. Bear remained as still as a statue, only his eyes following her every movement. When her small fingers finally touched the soft fur between his ears, Bear closed his eyes and let out a long, contented sigh. Lily giggled, the sound like wind chimes in the heavy silence of the house. "He's soft," she exclaimed, her fear vanishing as she dropped to her knees to hug the massive dog's neck. Mason watched the scene unfold. The tiny girl, in pink, embracing the lethal canine. He felt something deep in his chest tighten. It was a picture of the innocence he had fought to protect. But it was a sight he rarely ever got to witness. After getting Sarah settled on the worn but comfortable floral sofa in the living room, Mason took a moment to scan the room, while Sarah directed Lily to get an ice pack. The space was modest, filled with second-hand furniture. Everything was covered in knitted throws to hide the wear and tear. On the mantelpiece above a cold, dark fireplace sat a collection of framed photographs. Mason's eyes were drawn to one in the center, a man in a flannel shirt laughing with his arm around a younger Sarah. A black ribbon was tucked into the corner of the frame. It was the confirmation of everything Sarah had told him in the truck. She was doing this all alone. The house was clean, meticulously so, but it was undeniably chilly. Mason noticed Sarah pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders, even though she was inside. "It's bone-chilling in here," Mason observed, his brow furrowed. "Is your heat out?" Sarah looked away, embarrassed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The furnace has been giving us trouble for weeks. The landlord swore he would send someone, but it's December, so everyone is swamped," she said, forcing a brittle smile. "We just use extra blankets. It's fine." Mason remained silent, his gaze fixed as he walked over to the heating unit in the corner, a dusty old radiator system. "Do you have a toolbox?" he asked. Sarah blinked, surprised. "Under the sink in the kitchen." "But you really don't have to." Mason was already moving. "Bear, stay," he commanded softly. The dog remained curled up beside Lily, who was now showing him her prized collection of plastic dinosaurs. 10 minutes later, Mason was on one knee. His tactical sweater was rolled up to his elbows as he wrestled with a stuck valve on the old heater. He wasn't a licensed plumber, but his SEAL training had instilled a mechanical adaptability that could conquer anything from a Humvee engine to a failing generator in a sandstorm. "It's just a pilot light issue and a stuck intake valve," Mason called from the corner. "Carbon buildup." He gave the wrench a final decisive twist. There was a hiss, a click, and then the reassuring whoosh of the pilot light catching flame within moments. A low hum filled the apartment as a blessed warmth began to radiate from the vents. Sarah watched him from the sofa, an ice pack on her ankle. She saw the competence in his hands, the way he focused with such singular intensity. It had been 2 years since a man had fixed anything in her home. The sight brought a lump to her throat that she had to swallow down hard. "There," Mason said. Rising to his feet, he wiped his hands on a rag from the toolbox. "That should hold. You'll need a pro to clean it out, but you won't freeze tonight." "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me from a mugging. Drove me home and now you fixed my heat. I can't pay you right now, but..." Mason cut her off with a simple wave of his hand. "This wasn't about money, Sarah." He started to roll down his sleeves, his mind already on leaving. "I really should get going. Bear and I have a schedule to keep." He reached for the leash, but before the clip could snap shut, Sarah spoke up. "Wait, please," she said, "stay for dinner. It's not much, just tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, but it's hot, and it's the very least I can do." Mason froze. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to retreat, to return to the cold, solitary safety of his cabin, where civilization was a choice, not a performance. But then his gaze fell upon Lily, who stared up at him with such hopeful eyes, one small hand still lost in the thick fur of Bear's coat. "Please stay, Mr. Mason," Lily pleaded softly. "Bear wants to stay too." Mason glanced down at his loyal dog. Bear's tail gave a heavy thump of agreement. Mason released a long sigh, the sound of complete surrender. "Okay," he conceded, his voice barely a whisper. "Soup sounds good." The kitchen was tiny, and Mason's large frame seemed to consume the entire space as he took a seat at the unsteady wooden table. The meal couldn't have been simpler: canned tomato soup and sandwiches constructed from cheap white bread. But to Mason, it was more satisfying than any 5-star meal he had ever known. They ate in a peaceful rhythm, with Lily made brave by Bear's presence, chattering endlessly about her school, her teacher Mrs. Gable, who apparently had a mustache, and her desperate wish for a snow day. Mason found himself responding to her questions stiffly at first, but then with a surprising ease, telling her Bear's favorite food was steak, though he mostly got kibble, and that the dog could clear a fence as high as her head. Sarah watched them, her heart clenching in a way she never anticipated seeing a man seated at her table. Watching her daughter laugh with a father figure through the gaping void Michael had left into sharp relief. Yet it also kindled a warmth the heater could never produce. Mason, too, felt a strange storm gathering in his chest, stirred by the sheer domesticity of the scene. The quiet clinking of spoons, a child's innocent laughter, the scent of toasted cheese. It was all a sharp, agonizing reminder of the life he'd sacrificed for his duty. He felt like a fraud in this gentle world, a loaded weapon placed at a family dinner table, yet he couldn't fight the desperate craving he felt to remain in this fragile moment just a little longer. As he finished his soup, he looked to Sarah, whose warm eyes reflected the soft kitchen light. And for one fleeting second, the war, the chaos and the bitter cold outside simply vanished. The next morning dawned under a gray, oppressive sky that threatened snow, a perfect reflection of the knot of dread tightening in Sarah's stomach, despite her swollen ankle, which she had bound tightly in an ace bandage. She limped grimly toward the administrative trailer parked just behind the Christmas market's main stage. A text had arrived at dawn from the market manager, Mr. Henderson, demanding her immediate presence. Mr. Henderson was a man in his late 50s, balding and burdened with a perpetually anxious air. The type of man who wore ill-fitting suits and was constantly dabbing sweat from his upper lip. It didn't matter how cold it was outside. The moment Sarah stepped into the cluttered, paper-choked office, the air hung heavy with the scent of old coffee and palpable tension. Henderson refused to meet her gaze, his hands nervously shuffling papers across his desk, his entire posture screaming with unease. "Sarah, please sit down," he mumbled, motioning toward a flimsy folding chair. But Sarah stood her ground, planting her weight firmly on her uninjured leg. "I need to get back to my station, Mr. Henderson. What's going on?" she asked, even as an icy knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach. Henderson let out a heavy sigh, finally forcing his eyes to meet hers, his face contorted in a grimace. "There's been a complaint, Sarah, a very serious one, from Mr. Sterling." The name landed in the room like a lead weight. Sterling, the father of the very boy who had attacked her, and more critically, the primary financial sponsor of the entire Oak Ridge Christmas Festival. He's claiming that you and some aggressive associate of yours threatened his son and his friends, Henderson went on. His voice stretched thin and weak. "He says his son is traumatized. He's threatening to pull all his funding for next year if we continue to employ, and I'm quoting here, violent elements." Sarah felt the warmth drain from her face, a chilling emptiness taking its place. "That is a complete lie," she said. Her voice trembled with a rising tide of indignation. "They attacked me. They kicked me. My ankle is sprained because of what his son did. The man who helped me was only stopping them." Henderson held up a hand, his expression pained. "I believe you, Sarah. I really, truly do. Those kids are nothing but trouble. But Sterling is the one who writes the checks. My hands are tied." He slid a stark white envelope across the desk toward her. "This is your pay for the week, plus a little extra, but I can't have you working the booth tonight. Or for the rest of the season." Sarah just stared at the envelope. It wasn't just a job. It was Lily's tuition. It was the money for their heating bill. It was their Christmas dinner. "You're firing me." She whispered the words, catching in her throat. "Because I was the one who was attacked." Henderson couldn't even look at her. A flush of shame crept up his neck. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. The best thing is for you to just lay low for a while. Maybe we can try again next year." Sarah took the envelope, her dignity the only fragile thread holding back a scream of pure rage, and walked. She stepped out of the trailer and into the biting wind, jobless and utterly alone. But while Sarah was confronting this bureaucratic nightmare, a completely different scene was unfolding just 3 blocks away at Oak Ridge Elementary. Mason had shown up at Sarah's house early that morning, insisting on walking Lily to school himself so Sarah wouldn't have to put any more strain on her injured ankle. It was a sight that practically stopped traffic. A colossal, battle-tested Navy SEAL in a tactical jacket strode beside a small 6-year-old girl, her bright pink backpack a stark contrast with a powerful German shepherd at their side. Lily, far from being shy, looked as if she had just won the lottery, skipping gleefully at Mason's side. Her tiny hand was completely swallowed by his massive one. "Did Bear chase a squirrel?" she asked, gazing up at him with wide, adoring eyes. "He considered it," Mason corrected softly. "But Bear is disciplined. He stayed on target." Lily giggled, repeating the phrase, "on target." She repeated the military lingo, trying it out, while Bear trotted proudly, placing himself as a barrier between Lily and the passing traffic. His ears pivoted, tracking every single car that passed. As they approached the school gates, the other parents instinctively gave them a wide berth. Whispers followed them from behind cupped hands, but Lily just beamed. She wrapped her arms around Mason's leg and then, to the absolute shock of the watching mothers, she hugged the enormous dog right around his neck. "Bye, Mason, bye, Bear," she yelled before dashing into the schoolyard. Mason remained at the gate until she was safely inside, a strange, profound sense of purpose filling him for the first time in years. His mission was no longer to destroy or dismantle. It was simply to guarantee a little girl made it to school unharmed. It felt right. It felt important. Later that afternoon, the sky finally broke open, blanketing the town in heavy snowflakes. Mason found himself returning to Sarah's bungalow. His excuse was to check the pilot light he'd fixed the night before, but the truth was he couldn't shake the deep worry he felt for her. He knocked on the door. In his hand, he held a bag of fresh coffee beans, a peace offering for his intrusion. A long, tense silence hung in the air before the door finally creaked open. Sarah stood on the other side, still dressed in her work clothes, but her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. It was painfully obvious she had been crying. "Mason," she managed to say, her voice thick and cracking with emotion, as she struggled to pull herself together. She wiped at her cheeks hurriedly. I wasn't expecting you." Mason's brow furrowed, his protective instincts igniting in an instant. He moved inside, shaking snow from his boots as Bear followed, nudging Sarah's hand. "Pilot light check," Mason lied with practiced ease. His gaze, however, was locked on her face. "But it looks like the heater isn't the real problem here. What happened?" Sarah retreated to the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, every last ounce of fight draining from her. She told him everything, starting with the meeting with Henderson. She recounted the lies Sterling had told and the crushing loss of the job that was her only financial lifeline. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered. "The tuition is due Monday," she confessed, her gaze locked on the floor. "If I can't pay it, she loses her spot. And I just lost my job." Mason listened, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. The raw injustice of her situation burned right through him. He was a man of immediate action, one who solved problems with either brute force or resources. He reached into his back pocket and drew out his checkbook. He'd saved almost every single cent from his last 3 deployments. He had no family to support, no mortgage to pay, not a single debt to his name. "How much is it?" he asked, clicking the pen. "The tuition and the rent to cover a few months." How much?" Sarah looked up, confusion swirling in her tear-filled eyes. "What are you—" Mason stepped toward her. Placing the checkbooks on the coffee table, he insisted. "I have the money, Sarah. It's just sitting there in a bank not doing a thing. Let me handle this. You shouldn't have to carry this burden because some spoiled punk lied." He believed he was being the hero. He thought he was solving the mission. He was dead wrong. In an instant, Sarah's expression hardened, the sorrow erased by a flash of fierce, cold pride. She rose to her feet, completely ignoring the throbbing pain in her ankle. "Put that away," she commanded. Her voice was low, trembling with a barely contained fury. "Sarah, it's not a big deal. I just want to help," Mason started, but she cut him off sharply. "I said put it away," she snapped. "I am not a charity case, Mason. I'm not some beggar on a street corner." She took a ragged breath, her chest heaving. "I invited you into my home because you were kind. Mine? Not because I was looking for a handout. If I take your money, what does that make me? Just some helpless widow who needs a man to bail her out?" Her words struck him like a physical blow, hitting a nerve he never knew he had. He just stood there, the checkbook suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," Sarah replied, her own tone softening. Her voice softened, but her resolve was firm. "You're a fixer. You see something broken and you have to fix it. But my dignity isn't broken, and I won't sell it, Mason. Not even for Lily." Mason slowly capped the pen and slid the checkbook back into his pocket. He looked at Sarah, truly looked at her, and saw a strength that rivaled any soldier he had ever served with. She wasn't weak. She was trapped. and simply handing her money was an insult to her fight. He realized then he'd approached this like a tactical problem, completely ignoring the human heart at its center. "I'm sorry," Mason said, his voice laced with a raw sincerity she hadn't heard before. "You're right. I completely overstepped my bounds." He knelt down, stroking Bear's fur to collect his thoughts to reset. "I will never offer you money again," he promised, rising to meet her gaze, his eyes intense. "But I'm not going to stand here and watch you get crushed by a predator. Not by someone like Sterling. There must be another way. A way for you to fight this with your dignity intact." Sarah brushed a tear from her cheek, but this time a flicker of resolve showed through as she nodded. "I'll find a way," she whispered. "I always do." Mason saw the fierce determination set in her jaw and made a silent promise to himself. He would help her, but it would be on her terms. He would help her fight, not pay her way out. The suffocating tension in the room finally began to recede, leaving a heavy, contemplative silence hanging in the air. Mason had already tucked his checkbook away, understanding her refusal not as a personal rejection, but as a line she needed to draw. A line drawn by a woman clinging to the last remnants of her control. Regretting her sharp words, Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs. She offered one to Mason, her fingers grazing his calloused hand for just a heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Taking a seat on the far end of the frayed sofa, she admitted, "I'm just so tired and scared." Mason nodded slowly, his large hands enveloping the warm mug. His gaze fell to Bear, snoring gently at Lily's feet. The little girl was fast asleep on the rug, drained from the day's turbulent emotions. "You don't ever have to apologize," Mason said, his voice low so as not to wake the child. "I'm used to fixing problems with equipment, with planning. People are a hell of a lot harder." He took a slow sip of tea, staring into the dark liquid, as if searching for an answer he couldn't find. "You asked about Bear?" He began, the words emerging slowly, each one sounding like it was being pulled across shattered glass. "About why he's retired?" Sarah leaned forward almost imperceptibly, feeling he was about to offer a piece of his soul he kept hidden from the world. "He didn't just get old," Mason continued, his voice dropping. "We were in a terrible situation about 6 months back. An improvised device. Ooh. It detonated. Bear took the full force of the blast wave, shielding the team from the worst of the shrapnel. Physically, he recovered for the most part. But something inside him broke. He became jumpy. Loud noises, crowds. He couldn't filter the world out anymore. The vet said he'd served his time." Mason paused, his jaw clenching with the memory. "The truth is, Sarah, I'm not so different. They give it names, operational stress, PTSD, or whatever the new acronym of the week is, but mostly it's just a constant noise. Even when everything is quiet, my head is screaming. I'm always waiting for the next ambush, the next explosion. That's why I'm in this town, trying to find a quiet place where the noise finally stops." He met her gaze, his steel gray eyes vulnerable for the first time. "But being here with you with Lily, it's the first time in so long that the noise has finally dialed down." Sarah felt her heart break for him. She understood the burden of invisible wounds all too well. "I know the noise," she said softly. "But for me it's the silence that came after Michael died. The silence in this house was so deafening, it felt like it was physically crushing me. I would leave the TV on all night, just desperate to hear voices. I work myself to the point of collapse just so I'm too exhausted to think about how quiet it is on the other side of the bed." She looked at him, and in that fleeting moment 2 lonely, fractured souls found a bridge. They were fighting entirely different wars. One against the haunting memories of violence, the other against the hollow void of grief. But their pain spoke the same universal language. Mason reached across the space between them, covering her hand with his. He didn't say a word, but the warmth of his grip was a silent promise you are not alone in the dark anymore. The next morning, the harsh reality of the world intruded upon their fragile peace. Sarah had to return the Mrs. Claus costume, and she had to collect her few personal belongings from the market lockers. She left Lily with a neighbor, not wanting her daughter to witness the humiliation of walking back into the place where she had been so unjustly fired. Mason had offered to go with her, but Sarah insisted she had to do this herself, needing to prove that she could face Henderson and the others with her head held high. The market was bustling with midday shoppers, the festive music sounding like a cruel joke to Sarah's ears. She navigated toward the lockers near the back of the stalls, her stomach churning as she placed her tote bag on a bench to organize her things. She felt a presence loom behind her. It was the group of teenagers. The leader, the very boy who had kicked her, whose name she now knew was Braden Sterling, was leaning against a support beam, smirking. Braden was a lanky 17-year-old, with slicked-back blonde hair and eyes that held a disturbing lack of empathy, wearing a coat that cost more than Sarah's entire car. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Claus," he jeered. "Daddy said you got the boot. Good riddance." Sarah's body went rigid, her eyes refusing to meet his. "Leave me alone, Braden," she pleaded, her voice a strained whisper as she zipped her bag. "Haven't you done enough?" A cold chuckle escaped Braden as he exchanged a look with his friends. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, closing the distance between them. Then he lurched into her with a practiced clumsiness, muttering, "Oops, sorry about that." He stepped back immediately, a strange, victorious smirk playing on his lips. Sarah clutched her bag and hurried away as fast as her injured ankle would carry her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She just had to get away. But she wouldn't make it to the exit. As she neared the main gates, her escape was cut short. A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. "Hold it right there, ma'am." Sarah spun around, her blood running cold, to face a police officer. Officer Miller was a young rookie, barely 25, with a severe buzz cut and a uniform that looked unnaturally stiff, clearly eager to assert his authority. Beside him stood the market manager, Mr. Henderson, looking pale and deeply apologetic, and just behind them, Braden Sterling was pointing a condemning finger at her. With an actor's outrage, Braden shouted, "That's her, I saw her take it. She swiped my watch right when she bumped into me." A chilling dread washed over Sarah. "What? No, I didn't even touch him," she cried, her panicked gaze darting between the stone-faced men. Officer Miller stepped toward her, his face a grim, unyielding mask. "Ma'am, I need you to open your bag, now." Sarah's hand trembled so violently she could barely find the zipper. "I don't have anything," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I swear." The officer reached into her bag, and within seconds retrieved a gold Rolex from a side pocket, the exact one Braden had brushed against. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering crowd. "Well, well," Officer Miller said, dangling the watch like a trophy. "Looks like we have a thief. Ma'am, you're under arrest." He began to reach for his handcuffs. Pure, blinding panic seized Sarah's heart. "No, he planted it?" she choked out. "He's the one who bumped into me," she screamed, stumbling backward. "I have a daughter! You can't take me, please!" The crushing weight of the injustice was suffocating her. An arrest meant a record. It meant losing Lily. It meant her life was over. The officer brutally grabbed her wrist. He wrenched her arm behind her back. "Stop resisting!" he barked, as Sarah sobbed, her vision completely blurring with tears. The world felt like it was tilting off its axis. Just as the cold metal of the handcuffs touched her skin, a deep, commanding voice cut through the air like a whip. "Officer, stand down." The command wasn't a shout, but a projection of such absolute authority that every person there froze in place. Mason carved a path through the crowd, bare shadowing his every step in a perfect tactical heel. Mason wasn't wearing his coat. He stood in his tactical sweater and cargo pants, looking every bit the warrior he was moving with a lethal, fluid grace. He stepped directly into Officer Miller's personal space, and the officer, intimidated by the sheer size and intensity of the newcomer, released Sarah's arm instinctively. "Who are you? Back off, this is police business." Miller stammered his hand, dropping nervously toward his duty belt. Mason didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket slowly, and deliberately pulling out a leather wallet and flipping it open to reveal a military identification card. It bore a gleaming gold crest. "Lieutenant Commander Mason, United States Navy," he stated, his voice calm but as unyielding as iron. "And this woman is under my protection." He glanced at Sarah, his eyes quickly checking her for any injuries. His steel gaze then locked back onto the young officer. "You are arresting a grieving widow over a crime committed by a bored teenager officer, and you're doing it without a shred of due diligence." Braden lunged forward, desperately trying to regain control. "She stole my watch, look. He found it." Mason turned his head slowly, his eyes falling upon the boy. The look was so terrifyingly devoid of emotion that Braden's words simply died in his throat. "I saw you," Mason stated, a quiet lie. Or perhaps it wasn't a lie at all. "And I know there are security cameras covering this entire area." He pointed to a black dome on a light pole directly above the lockers. "So here is precisely what is going to happen," Mason declared, turning his attention back to Officer Miller and Mr. Henderson. "You are not putting cuffs on her. We are all going to the security office. We will review that footage, and if I see this boy planting that watch, I will personally file charges for filing a false police report and for defamation." He took a single step closer to Miller. "Do we have an understanding, officer?" Miller glanced at the military ID. He looked at the cameras, and then at the trembling form of Sarah. The rookie's false confidence completely evaporated. Yes. Yes, sir. We should check the footage first. It's standard procedure." Mason gave a single sharp nod and then turned to Sarah. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured, the hardness in his voice instantly dissolving into warmth. "Monitoring?" "I've got you. No one is taking you anywhere." At those words, Sarah finally broke, collapsing against him and burying her face deep in his chest, sobbing with relief, his strong arm the only thing keeping her from completely shattering in the air. The air inside the cramped security office of the Oak Ridge Christmas market was stale and thick with unbearable tension as Sarah sat on a metal folding chair, her face a ghostly white, her hands trembling in her lap while Officer Miller stood uncomfortably by the door, the gold Rolex watch sealed in an evidence bag on the desk. Braden Sterling, the teenager who had orchestrated this entire nightmare, leaned against the wall with a smug expression, checking his phone, as if destroying a woman's life was merely a boring interlude in his day. "This is a total waste of time," Braden muttered, rolling his eyes. "You found the watch in her bag. She stole it. Book her so I can go home." Mason stood like a statue in the center of the room, his eyes completely fixed on the bank of monitors, where Mr. Henderson was frantically trying to rewind the security footage. "We wait," Mason said, his voice a low rumble that brokered no argument. "Play it back. Camera 4:12:14 p.m. Henderson's shaky fingers hit the button. On the grainy screen, the incident played out. Sarah walking away, Braden approaching her from behind the collision. It happened in a flash, too fast for the low-resolution camera to clearly show Braden's hand slipping the watch into her tote. But Mason pointed a calloused finger at the screen. "There," he said sharply. "Look at his body mechanics. He didn't stumble, he leaned in. His right shoulder dipped. That's a controlled movement, not an accident." Officer Miller squinted at the screen, looking doubtful. "It's blurry, sir. It looks like a bump. I can't arrest this kid based on a shoulder dip." Braden scoffed, emboldened by the officer's hesitation. "See, he's making it up. And you know what? I bet she took my wallet, too. I can't find it. It was in my coat pocket." He turned to Sarah with a predatory smirk. "Where is it? Did you hide it somewhere else?" Sarah shook her head frantically, tears welling up again. "I didn't take anything, I swear." Mason looked at Braden, noticing the subtle twitch in the boy's eye, a telltale sign the boy was overplaying his hand. "You lost your wallet too?" Mason asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Just now." Braden nodded vigorously. "Yeah, a Louis Vuitton, worth more than her car. She probably tossed it when she saw the cops." Mason turned to the officer. "If she ditched it, it's nearby. Bear can find it." Before Braden could even object, Mason gave a sharp command, "Bear search." He unclipped the leash. The German Shepherd sensed the immediate shift in his handler's energy. He got to work without a moment's hesitation, circling Sarah's bag with deep, purposeful sniffs, then moved to Braden, who flinched as the damp nose brushed against his coat. Bear let out a sharp, sudden sneeze. The scent was still fresh. Mason opened the office door and gave the order, "Find it." Bear trotted back into the market, his nose glued to the ground. Mason Miller and a reluctant Braden followed close behind, but the dog didn't have to go far. He bypassed the lockers entirely, heading straight for a large green city trash can tucked behind a hot chocolate stand just 10 yards from where the collision had happened. Bear rose onto his hind legs, placed his paws on the rim, and let out a single sharp bark, the clear alert signal. Mason moved in. He pulled on a pair of tactical gloves from his pocket, lifted the heavy lid, and saw it immediately right on top of a pile of discarded paper cups. It was a sleek, brown leather wallet. Mason picked it up, turned, and held it out for Braden to see. "Is this yours?" he asked. All the color drained from Braden's face. She must have thrown it in there." But Mason just shook his head, his eyes turning to ice. "Wrong. If she'd thrown it, your scent might be on the outside, but hers would be imprinted all over the leather too. But more importantly," Mason said, pointing to the snow around the can, "there are no footprints here besides your own, from when you walked over just 5 minutes ago to dump it. I saw you. The tread pattern from your sneakers is a perfect match." He then looked at Officer Miller. He planted the watch, then dumped the wallet to make the charges more severe. "It's a complete frame-up." Officer Miller stared at the footprints in the otherwise pristine snow. Then he looked at the terrified teenager, and the rookie cop's entire demeanor shifted. "Mr. Sterling," Miller said. His voice deepened with newfound authority. "I think you need to come with me. Filing a false police report is a very serious crime." As the officer led the sputtering teenager away, Mr. Henderson rushed over to hand Sarah her bag, apologizing over and over.